Yeah, I didn't realize at the time that this was going to be starting a new genre. I sort of realized it was unlike anything I had encountered up to that point, and so maybe subconsciously, if anybody had asked, I would have realized, yeah, this is something new. But still, I wouldn't have guessed that it was going to catch on so much. To say I was giving it a backstory is being generous, just like saying it had a language parser is generous. Certainly, I tried to make the various puzzles within the game interlock and have things that would carry forward to to where this thing that happened here matters later, and oh, you thought you were done with this part of the cave, but look, there's something else you can do there, and so on. But to say that I actually went back to figure out what happened in the past to set up this situation, and no, that wasn't something that was really on my radar. It was more trying to make the puzzles themselves interesting and, as I say, interlocking and building up to something. Frankly, I think the Infocom games did a much better job of that because they started out with the idea of having a storyline and having the clues and things build toward that. But they didn't exist yet, so I was still feeling my way around. Yeah, it was called Advent, but that's because it was on a computer system where file names were limited to 6 letters. So, when you started it, it said "Welcome to Adventure." So it was clearly the full name of it, but it tended to get called Advent for a while, again, precisely because of the artifact of the computer naming scheme. Zork was originally developed, as I'm sure you know, at MIT, using the Muddle system, and the people who developed it, again, had encountered adventure. I mean, MIT and Stanford had a very close relationship across the ARPANET, and so I was in direct contact with them, and they were developing Zork, and just as I had made adventure available for people to play, I mean, I had an account on the AI system at MIT, and I could connect across the net and log in. I played Zork there in its original form before it was commercial. In fact, I remember still sort of the point at which I stopped playing Zork, which was I'd almost gotten the full score, or reached, or at least gotten to the whatever end game it might have. It solved all the puzzles I could find, and it was pretty clear to me there was just one thing left to solve, and it involved a Fabergé egg in a tree in the forest, and that's the one they added. That and a waterfall, something around the waterfall. In any case, I had one puzzle left to solve, but it was, I'd been up all night, time to go home, go to sleep. As I was driving home from the AI lab, it occurred to me, I'll bet this is what I need to do to solve that puzzle. I'll try it when I go back the next day. Went back the next day, they had expanded the game with another half dozen puzzles. Which I say that maybe that's where the Fabergé egg showed up. But anyway, alright, I almost had this game finished, and it just got bigger. Oh, I'm never going to finish this game at this rate. And I just sort of stopped trying it at that point. Perhaps more to the surprising is the fact I didn't have any real experience with role-playing games either. I liked games, I liked programming, but both of those genres were pretty new to me. Yeah, I started programming when I was 11, and back when that was still unusual, like 65. Well, again, since I wasn't into role-playing, which was the thing that it was most like, there were other games that I had been playing and maybe even occasionally toying around with, making versions of myself, but none of them were really that similar to adventure. The closest would probably have been Hunt the Wumpus, which is a classic game on Unix systems, where you are sort of exploring a cave, but it's all done, just the rooms have numbers, and when you're in a room it tells you what numbered rooms you can get to, and there are clues saying how far away various hazards and goals are. but there's no real story to it, and the bats and pits you're avoiding and the wumpus that you're hunting, the messages about them are pretty constant. It's not really an adventure game. It's more of a puzzle-solving game. Sort of the combination was somebody else stumbled across it and told me about it. So I was at Stanford, my first year as a grad student there. One of the other first-year grad students had a job at the Stanford Medical Center. That was John Gilbert. And he came across this program that had somehow migrated onto the computer there and thought it was a neat little game and told the rest of us about it. And so I managed to get a copy of it from that system onto the Stanford Ai Lab machine where I had an account. And they were running slightly different operating systems, but they were close enough that you could actually run it on the other machine. And so I could try it out there and get an idea of what it was like. And there were bugs and places you could get to where you couldn't get out of, and various places where the game I thought didn't do something reasonable when I tried something. And just I began having lots of ideas for ways to modify it and make it either more cohesive or just have more stuff to do in it. I enjoyed games in general where you have to think and figure out how to solve a puzzle of some sort. I mean, solitaire games are often like that in general, where you're trying to figure out the combination of moves to get to to accomplish what you need. But here was an environment where the sorts of puzzles you could come up with was open-ended. As the game designer got to think of what it was you were trying to do, instead of it being, well, come up with a set of rules and then there's just random elements that make the puzzle different each time. So here, clearly there was going to be a limitation as a result that once you've solved all the puzzles, you're done. But that meant that, from my point of view, I could have all the fun of coming up with more puzzles, whereas other people, once they solved all the puzzles, they were done. I was never done. I could always come up with more puzzles. And certainly I had other friends around at the time who, had the same mindset, and we would occasionally just be bouncing ideas off each other as to things we could add to the game that would, here'd be a nifty twist. Suppose you had this place that you had to drop everything to get through this narrow passage. That meant you couldn't bring the lamp with you, and now what do we do with that? And so there are all sorts of situations where, again, there was no limit on what you could include in the game. It's just a small matter of programming, as they say. The people who were doing the haunted house and the spaceship adventure and the Zork and so forth, they were doing it because they had run into adventure. And the reason people were encountering adventure was because I was not making myself hard to find. I had the people at various colleges around the ARPANET who I was sharing it with, saying, here you can log in and play it. Here's and word was traveling by word of mouth that if you want a copy of the source, send me enough to cover mailing you a tape or something, and I'll write it for you, no problem. So in general, most people who had a copy of Adventure, at least for a while, had it because they'd gotten it from me, or at least had contacted me at some point. And so, not to mention the Adventure itself had my then current address built into the initial help text. So, I was not hard to find. I've never gotten tired of to who come around to this day and just sort of want to ask some questions, like you, or occasionally I'll just get a message saying that I found your contact information and I wanted to send thank you for many hours of fine play and so on. And that never gets tiresome. Yeah, and some of them, they actually sent me some money along the way, and many of them didn't. And, the ones that didn't were, a little bit annoying in that regard. I didn't mind if people wanted to get a copy of it and play with it and maybe make it available for other people to play for free. But when somebody else took it and turned it into a version that they charged for and didn't give me anything for it, that was sort of annoying. But, what can you do?
Well, did you ever consider legal action?
No, it's too much trouble. I mean, the money involved and the money I had and time I had to worry about it, no, I never went down that path. Again, I would call it, basically puzzle designer. It's, as you say, it's not something that is generally, useful, but there, certainly even before computers and adventure games, there have been people whose job it was to come up with puzzles where, eventually you figure out and have the aha moment, which is so satisfying, and you solve it and you're done. And this was, as just a form where I could design such things and have them solved on a computer, where it could keep track of details and so on. That it lets you design a sort of puzzle that previously couldn't exist. Because other ones sort of, everything had to be laid out in front of you, and here you can get more information along the way. And you could do it with things like the adventure books and whatnot, but there really wasn't that much of that sort of puzzle until there was a computer that could keep track of the details for you. I hadn't done it partly because I'm not a graphics person, and partly because the facilities available to me, hacking or otherwise, just weren't up to that level of detail. So that's not the sort of game I've done. I've played a couple of them, although not so much the ones where you really need the graphics. They're more the ones where they're setting the tone, like The Pawn is one that I have, where the graphics, I got it in part because the graphics were okay, the music was wonderful. And I liked the fact that at the time that the games were becoming more sophisticated and sort of prettier that way. And again, there are things you can then do, puzzles you can create that require observation instead of just thinking. It's a different part of the brain that gets exercised for where the information comes from of what are the rules here, what can I do, what are the effects, how can I put that together to get the result I need, and so forth. And both of them are susceptible to the same flaw that it's either in text or in a picture, it's easy to overlook an essential detail. And perhaps more to the point, it's very hard as the game designer to realize which things are going to be overlooked. Because different people are going to look at pictures or are going to read text with a different mindset. They're just going to happen to blink at the wrong point and miss this essential clue. And the job of the game designer is to make sure that there's something that brings you back, either a hint or something where it comes back again, you have another chance to notice it, something, so that you don't just get stuck and give up. But like I said, you can do that. You have the same problem, just in a different form with the image-based puzzles. And yet it's a fine thing. It opens up, again, a new realm of puzzle that you can build. Where, because there are things where if you have to describe it, and you run into this in role-playing games all the time, where, it's sort of in the reverse case, where if the game master describes the room, then either he has to spend a long time describing lots of stuff, most of which is red herrings or just window dressing, or the players know that any detail he gives is probably important and they should be paying attention to it. Mm-hmm. And both of those are bad. If what you have is, the GM could just show you the room, and it's up to you to look around and realize what's in it and ask questions about the parts that you think might be important and so forth. That's a very different style of play, and one that players actually don't have a lot of experience with, so they're not that good at it. But when you can find a game master who can do that, it works very well. And there are a few others that caught on to a lesser degree. One sharp, nasty knife is thrown at you. And there are probably a few others like that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But Maze of Twisty Little Passages is definitely a term that has entered the culture. Zizzy shows up the same way. I've seen systems where XYZZY was a command for swapping between two states, for example. You want to go in and out of operator mode, or I use it occasionally when I want to as my command when I'm logged into one computer to log into a different one, and it can go back and forth, so it acts like it does in the game. I just wanted to have one last thing that was just a real bear to figure out. There's some real minor clues dropped in game, but frankly, some people solve that one by disassembling the program and trying to figure out, well, let's look for an increment instruction, so something that adds 1, and then see what's going on in that vicinity and work backwards from there. So, later versions I tried to make it a little more of a clue as to how to get that point, but mostly it was just there to be annoying and make it hard to get the full score. In version 1 of Adventure, I worked on for probably about 4 months, all told, from when I first ran into it and began trying to figure out how it worked and how to change it, and getting hold of Crowther and then modifying the source and eventually making the first version available. And that one sort of sat around for a year, and I would occasionally make small changes, adding little features. Somebody would try doing something with a particular object or creature or whatnot, and nothing, no special message would show up, and I'd think, oh yeah, it really ought to say something, because you tried something original. Here, we'll put in a snide remark in response, drive on. But then that version's the one that, for the year that followed, as I got requests for copies of it, I would hand out the source for that one. And then after about a year, I had come up with enough ideas of my own for expanding the game. I came out with what I called version 2, with 5 new treasures, all of which I thought were as hard as any, each individually I thought was as hard as anything in the original game. And I thought they built on each other more and so forth. So that has the flying carpet and so on. And that one didn't get distributed as often. The requests had tapered off some. And having learned my lesson from the first one, I was trying to be a little more careful about not letting people get it if I thought they were going to be selling it on their own. But still, if somebody wanted a copy of it for their own use or to work on, I didn't have a problem with that. A couple of cases of that. One of them was the one I mentioned with Software Toolworks, where they wanted Crowther and me to endorse their version of the game, and I think if you got full score in that version of the game, you got a code you could send in, and they would mail you a certificate acknowledging you as a Grandmaster or Adventure Grandmaster or whatever the term was for that, and that had Crowther and my signatures on it. And so in return for the endorsement and our use of the signatures on those certificates, they paid us a modest royalty for a while, and it tapered off. And we actually, they wanted us to endorse it as the original adventure. And we asked, well, we need to see a copy of it then. And so they sent it to us, and Crowther and I played it over at his house. And we ended up, no, we can't endorse it as the original adventure, but what we basically said in the endorsement was it has all of the features of original adventure and some extensions that we feel are in the spirit of the original game. But they had added at least 2, maybe 3 puzzles of their own. And we just said, well, if it's not the original adventure. I'm sorry, we're not going to lie in this endorsement, but we still think it's a fine game. We're willing to give you the endorsement for it, but we have to be careful of exactly what we make claim in that endorsement. There were really a couple of things going on. Well, three if you count the fact that the friend of mine, we had two or three of us who were working on that description. And mostly it's that, well, we'd been up all night and the three of us had driven off to Mount Diablo to watch the sunrise and then gone back to the lab. And so, we were running on no sleep and high energy and sat down to write that description. But the goal we had going into it was, well, first and foremost, we did explicitly want it to be a room with an enormous amount of detail and no purpose to it whatsoever, just as a red herring. But to make it worth your while, we wanted the description to be worth reading. We didn't want it to just be, droning on with no, you don't want to read it. So we want people to be, going over it because it looked interesting. And so, yeah, we spent a good chunk of the morning thinking about things that should be included, and there are, as you say, clearly literary references in there, but nothing specific. I mean, yeah, there's a volcano because we were probably thinking Mount Doom, but it wasn't specifically trying to look like anything from Lord of the Rings or any other particular other literary work. It was just sort of inspired by having read some of those and taking a thesaurus and looking for other words that can mean this, that, and the other breathtaking, spectacular, crashing, down, and et cetera, et cetera. And we wanted it to be something that the player didn't mind reading. It was fun to read, but we explicitly did want it to have it be a place where, okay, and now having seen all that, you try to do something at that location, and there's really nothing to do. It's just there to suck your time away and have a good time reading it. The one in particular who helped with that description was, again, John Gilbert, the one who had originally found the program for me earlier at the Med Center. There were various people at the AI Lab who contributed in small ways in that I'd be watching them play, and like I said, they'd try something. I think rubbing the lamp might have already been in there from Crowther's version, but there were others, like putting oil in the bottle, putting oil in the vase, I think was probably one of the ones that showed up, and so forth. Things people would try that I go, oh, yeah, I could put a message in for that. There were a few things people tried that I said, no, I ain't touching that one with a 10-foot pole. But none of them contributed in major ways. The only other person who really contributed a lot to the content of the game would be a fellow by the name of Bob Pariseau, who was my roommate for part of that period as well. And he had this sort of twisted sense of humor and evil think for how to set things up. I think the clam was his idea, and I think the narrow passage probably was also. Those are the two main ones I can think of. I mean, we didn't socialize very much in general. We met occasionally, but we didn't hang out together at all. We exchanged. When I got hold of him the first time, and he sent me the sources. And all he asked was, if I made changes, he wanted to copy back, and I did that, no problem. But we didn't generally get together for stuff. There were a couple of things. Well, the internal design I changed a whole bunch. There were a lot of special case sections in his code. Any time there was a place where going this direction might take you to more than one place at random, that was a special case in his code for that direction at that location. Well, choose some random numbers and pick where to go. And I decided there were too many places I wanted to do things like that, or whether you can go there depends on whether you're carrying the gold nugget and so on and so forth. And I said, let me make all of these things data driven. So I changed the structure of the program completely. But in terms of the the layout of the cave, the items you could find, the goals you had. I kept all of that. The closest I came to changing the intent, let's see, a couple, they're both sort of related to the maze. His maze of twisty little passages, he only had the one that was all like, the all different came later. That might be another one that Paraso thought of, I'm not sure. But we changed the maze, because the original maze of twisted little passages was far too easy to get through. It was like, go south until you can't anymore, then go east until you run to the place where you can crawl down and get out. And I said, nah. And so I came up with a restructured maze of twisted little passages, and then Paraso and I sat down with what I had come up with and tried, okay, let's suppose you keep going in one direction until you get stuck and then pick another direction. For all combinations of directions, like, let's make sure that doesn't work. Let's try alternating two directions back and forth for a while, and so on. Tried various simple ways to try to get through the maze and make sure none of them worked. So in that sense, we changed Crowther's original design, but I don't think that was particularly his intent. And again, a lot of my additions later sort of violate his design in that his was modeled after a real cave, and I didn't have a real cave to go on. I was just adding things wherever I thought it would be interesting to put something. And therefore, the stuff in my in my additions tended to be more fantastic. I mean, yeah, he had the snake and the bird and the dwarves, but dragons, trolls, golden tridents. No, those were beginning to be a little more outre. The other thing where I sort of had to change Crowther's setup, and again, it's not something I think was an essential part of his design, was the dwarves. They were originally set up in his version that, after a certain point they would, some number of dwarves between about 3 and 5 would show up at various places, fixed places within the cave, and then from then on they would walk around following a fixed path, unless they happened to run into you, in which case they would start following you. And when I was working on it, I expanded the cave by about a factor of 3 in my first version, and added another chunk for the version 2. And it was just too big at that point to have the dwarves following a fixed path. I didn't want to have to design a fixed path that would take them to all the interesting places. B, you might wander around the cave forever and never run into one of them because they just happen to be on different parts. And so I changed it to make the dwarves actually sort of move at random around the cave, using the same tables that describe how you can move, where can you get to from this location. They're not, in general, inhibited by, whether they have to drop things or whether they can be carrying gold nuggets and whatnot. Say, if you can get from here to there, fine, they can do it. And, as I worked with that, I found I had to make them a little bit smarter, so that, for example, they won't tend to go into dead ends. Or basically I could mark certain places as, the dwarves won't go here, because otherwise they'd spend too much time. You'd eventually find all of the dwarves collected inside the maze, because they couldn't happen to get out by random walking. And they won't turn around unless they do reach a dead end, and so forth. But, because I did that, and suddenly the dwarves can get all over the place, and you can run into them anywhere, and that's sort of the way I wanted that to work.
So, one question, which is one of the things that motivated me, is why does the rod scare the bird?
Okay, that's again one of the relatively few weird twists that was in Crowther's version, and I chose to keep it. And as near as I can tell, that's just there as a clue that the rod is unusual in some way. And, I guess the bird's afraid of magic or something. But yeah, it's a way for the it's just another form of puzzle because yes, you have to catch the bird, and by the time you get to the rod, you're probably in a state where anything you find that you can pick up, you do, and so the fact that you've picked it up now causes you a problem, and recognizing it is tricky, and it's one of the features of sort of a very early example of this form of game design. And it's to his credit that he recognized he needed something of this sort, that the rod scares the bird. Well, the rod scares the bird in order to make it hard to catch the bird. But for good measure, if you trying to remember whether there was something in Crowther's version that actually gave you that clue. I mean, there was certainly a hint.
Oh, there was certainly... No, that's the instructions.
Yeah, right.
So there's a number of things happen, including the rod scares the bird.
Right.
So
that was blatantly in there.
Yeah,
okay.
So that's what I mean. You run into this non sequitur, which gives you the player...
Right, the things have unexpected consequences. Right, so that was in the help text as the clue. Okay, so...
That's what I mean. You're
right. I'm fuzzing on what was in different versions, because I think in at least one of my versions, if not version 1, certainly by version 2, the explicit message about the rod scaring the bird, I think, is gone. And now instead there are hints. For example, if you wave the rod, the bird flies agitatedly for a moment. So it's now in the game experience rather than just being told. You're shown that the rod scares the bird, and therefore maybe gives you a clue that there's something to be done about it. I think and there's an in-game hint that if you do a few things in the vicinity of the bird, and basically if you've been in that location for some number of turns and you've done a couple of things involving the bird, then about the third time you try something with the bird as the object, it'll ask you, are you trying to catch the bird? And if you say yes, it says, would you like a hint? And it'll cost you a couple of points. Of course, it only costs you a couple of points the first time you play through the game. You can always come back later. And the hint basically is that something seems to be scaring the bird. And maybe another line like that. And so you put it together, you go, when you wave the rod, the bird's agitated. The hint is something scaring the bird. Okay, and you gradually figure out that if you just leave the rod somewhere else, then it makes it possible to catch the bird. But in the meantime, the rod itself, of course, has a purpose, which actually isn't needed. It's one of those sort of weirder bits in the original game that you can use it to create the crystal bridge, but you don't really need to do that to win the game. It's convenient, perhaps, to as a shortcut for getting between a couple of places, but you don't really have to travel that particular connection. And in version 2, I went back and revisited it and created a place where the whole idea was to free the bird and wave the rod to scare the bird, and then the bird will do something for you. and I had put in a clue somewhere in that area to indicate that it would be useful to do this, but that's an example of the level of puzzle that showed up in version 2. I actually have better information on that now than I used to. I used to think that I'd made the first version available in 76 and the second one and version 2 in 77, and eventually, about a year ago, I found out those dates are off by a year, that 77 and 78. And the way we found that out was somebody who was looking for a copy of the original source. And
Professor Schurz.
Yes. And in trying to find it, I ran across, I eventually got in touch with, I think it's Bruce Baumgart, who has a copy of the original archives from the Ai Lab machine, and he made them available to me to rummage around in, and I found, this file is clearly a collection of all the strings I could find in Crowther's version, the executable. And, here's sort of the first version, or Crowther's source, or something close to it that I was already modifying, and so on. And just based on the dates for those files, I think it was around February of 77 that I got hold of it and got the original from Crowther, and then I'd have to look at my files to see where I've researched this and recorded the details, but basically by around April to June is when I was polishing the first version. Like I had a version available in April, and then June I added the end game, for example, something on that order. But from February to June or maybe July is about the range that I was working on it. And then, as I say, it sort of lay fallow while people were playing it, and more ideas were accumulating as to interesting puzzles and more complex puzzles that could be fit into the game without having to change the overall structure too much. Right, yeah, this was at the Stanford Ai Lab, which was out in the foothills behind Stanford. I forget if the building is still there, whether it's been torn down. Certainly it got sold, and the lab is no longer there and hasn't been for quite a while, but I'm not sure if the building is gone. You can find photos of it on the net if you go look for it. It was called the DC Powers Lab. And it's because it was Donald C. Power, and not because there was an AC Power Lab somewhere else. But anyway, so yeah, that's where the artificial intelligence crowd from Stanford worked. They had a computer out there, and it was a nice big roomy place, and there were various individual offices and doubled up offices and terminals throughout the place, which was very advanced for the day. It was a single computer with multiple terminals sharing the resource. Yeah, it was an interesting environment to be working in, because it was, as I say, fairly remote, and the building itself had a lot of character to it. It was sort of a curved building and finding your way around in it could be interesting. And there were all sorts of odd things in various corners of the building. There's a room that had a collection of robots, an automated cart and a set of mounted arms, where the robotics students had been trying different ideas for how to make a robot that could manipulate things in various ways, and all sorts of odd things tucked away that it was a fine place to explore and spend time in. Yeah, not to mention that, as I say, the system was fairly impressive for its day. I mean, because this was still in the day where a lot of people were doing things where you submit things on punch cards and wait for them to run on a batch machine and get the printout back. And here you're doing it interactively, on a display screen that could not only show text, but could show text with different degree, in different fonts and with different degrees of highlighting, and could even show images, the shock. And it was all, black and white, black and green, I guess. But still, the level of thing you could do with the system there was well ahead of the technology of the day. Sure, the other people around the lab knew about it and were playing the game. That's where I got a lot of my playtesters, particularly because part of the setup there was that if you typed the appropriate combination of keystrokes from your keyboard, you could make your screen display what somebody else was looking at on their screen. And so if I looked and I saw, somebody's playing Adventure, okay, let me watch. Oh, they tried that. Okay, I'll make it do something next time. And of course, if I really wanted to be sneaky, there were things you could do where you could type at somebody else's, you type at your keyboard and have it be as though they typed it at theirs, or you could make text show up on their screen and have it look like the program had printed it out. And so, I'd have times where, just to be, annoying, I would have an entire paragraph of text show up with, a wizard showing up and doing something and vanishing again in a puff of smoke, and they then try to react to that. And of course, the game had no idea what they were talking about because it wasn't really in the game. But hey, had your fun. Some of the other students I knew at Stanford mentioned Dungeons and Dragons and invited me to a session. Basically, they found out that I didn't know what it was, and they said, "Well, you wrote adventure and you've never played Dungeons and Dragons? Well, here, you should." And so, I got involved in a D&D campaign for a while, and have since I've run my own, and in fact, that's how I met my wife, was running a D&D campaign for them. The role-playing aspect is sort of missing from the text adventure games. You can try to do it, but who are you role-playing for? Some of the later, more sophisticated text adventures, you really do have to get yourself in the mindset of the role if you want to be able to figure out what you're supposed to do. But for adventure and some of the other early games like that, you really are just sort of trying to find out what the ground rules are for the world you're in and solve the puzzles. Whereas for D&D, you really have a character, and you're trying to behave in character, which sort of takes a different mindset, and B, the character is going to continue to evolve. That's the other main difference. That there are later computer games that take that into account as well, of course, where you have characters that you build up and continue to make stronger over a series of adventures of sorts. But the early text adventures didn't have that. You finished the game, you were done. Whereas the D&D was open-ended. So it was, there were clearly similarities, and I could understand why people were surprised that I wasn't familiar with the genre. Now, Crowther, of course, was. So, it explains why the game has that feel to it. But the two genres are different enough that I don't consider one to be a prerequisite to the other, or to appreciating the other. Yes and no. Some of the puzzles, they're all different, and I thought some of them were more interesting than others. Some of the stuff that's in there, it's that I really like, isn't even the puzzles. Like the breathtaking view. I had a grand time with that one, and it's totally irrelevant. You don't need it to go there at all for the game. But there were a few where I liked the fact that the setup was there. You can figure out how things work, and then you have to figure out how to use this. These apparent, not obviously related facts to solve this particular puzzle. The Troll Bridge is perhaps the best example of that, where you have to give the troll a treasure to get across the bridge. And yet you have to have all the treasures at the end of the game to get full score. And not only do you have to go across the bridge, but then when you try to come back, the troll's not there. As soon as you start to cross the bridge on the way back, he pops up again and wants another treasure to let you go back across the bridge. And so that's 2 treasures you're down. And there are ways to avoid having to spend either of those 2 treasures, but figuring out those 2 things, they're two completely different solutions to how to get across one direction, how to get back the other direction without spending a treasure. And in each case, it's not immediately obvious, this is for dealing with the troll. And so, you figure something out, and then you have to realize, that's useful over here. So that's one that I really liked. The version 2 has, as I said, the flying carpet, which I thought was a particularly sweet set of puzzles that, again, involves recognizing that things that you're finding elsewhere that are parts of other puzzles are now being reused, starting with the carpet itself. The wording for the clue that you get at the start of the flying carpet sequence also has sort of a really bad pun in it, so I like that too. Oh, right. And then the puzzle that I sort of like the most isn't really obviously there. Again, it's sort of added in version 2. In version 1, I sort of wanted to have a time limit so you couldn't take forever to get everything done if you wanted to get top score. And the mechanism I added for that was sort of clunky, which was to put in the vending machine where you could get fresh batteries. If you wandered around too long, your lamp would run out. You'd have to spend a treasure if you wanted to keep going, and so you couldn't get top score if you took too long. And that was unsatisfying in many ways, one of which was that you had to, or one way to get around it was to simply turn off the lamp a lot of the time when you were doing things and then turn it on again. And so you're actually taking longer in order to preserve the batteries, but that wasn't really my goal, to make it take more steps. Plus, when I came around to doing version 2, a lot more of this game was happening outside the cave, and you didn't need the lamp at all for that, so that mechanism wasn't going to work anymore. And I decided in version 2 I was just going to be upfront about it, and every once in a while it'll say, you're taking too many turns and you lose some points. And I think that first happens at 350 turns, and then at 500 you lose a couple more points, and finally like 1,000, 2,000 turns. It goes, are you still doing this? And docks another 5 or 10 points. And the reason this turns into a puzzle is you can solve all of the obvious puzzles of getting treasures out and collecting them all, and even finishing the end game, and you find you're not getting full score, and because you took too long for it, and suddenly you realize there's this additional layer of, how do I do all of these things which are sort of unrelated? You go to this part of the cave, you do this, you go to that part of the cave and you do that. And how do you get all of that stuff done and do it in 350 turns or less? And you just go, oh, darn, I have to figure out, right, let's take these things that I'm going to need to solve these puzzles, because they're all in the same general area, and I'll make this path and do all of these things as I go by, but I'm limited to 7 items that I can carry during all this time, so I can't just pick up everything and just make one sweep. And you occasionally have to stop off and drop things off. Okay, so what order do you want to do things in? And there are some really sweet tricks that just aren't obvious that you can use to shave time off your total time. And in fact, if you do manage to get top score, including getting everything done in 350 turns, you get the message, acknowledging your adventurer grandmaster, and congratulating you on it. And then it sort of adds, it may interest you to know that the cave master himself has never succeeded in doing everything in getting top score in less than 330 turns. And so if you've managed it in 350, but not in 330, you have this additional challenge, if you care to try it, of trying to shave even more turns off, just for the satisfaction of matching the time I was able to do. And like I said, there are some really sweet, to do that, you really need to know things like, there are clues in the game where it says, in many cases, if you name a place that you're trying to reach, you can just go there. It knows the path. And there are times where, in fact, that means my path for getting those 330 points, 330 turns, includes when you go across the troll bridge. As soon as you're on the other side of the bridge, you can say view, and it'll go to the breathtaking view, which happens to be the fastest way to get to a room that's just near there, rather than walking through several rooms to get to the other end of that section of the cave. And therefore, it actually provides an excuse to go look at the breathtaking view, because it's the shortest route, in some sense, in number of turns, even if it involves, in a role-playing sense, it would involve walking through a whole bunch more of the cave. So, but there are all these little tricks you can find to shave turns off, and basically that's another level of puzzle, which I'm sort of proud to have worked into it. And I was watching a little bit, from the games I was getting, I was watching some of the evolution of the form where it would go from straight text adventure to text adventure with a sort of mouse-driven UI for manipulating things, and maybe background pictures that would have clues, but not yet truly interactive images. And so the games are becoming more sophisticated, as partly because the computers are becoming more powerful for running them. And like I said, I sort of had copies of some of them. I would occasionally see one and decide I'd get a copy of it, but I wasn't really following it as an industry. I was following it more as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
People in that community do contact me now and again for various reasons. Sometimes just to say thank you, and sometimes because they have questions. I've gotten copies of some games and tried them out, but not too often. I just don't have the time to work through an entire adventure game these days. I'm playing in multiplayer online games, which was, again, this was something I didn't do until a few years ago when I said some friends and I were considering starting one up. And I didn't actually have any experience with multiplayer online games. And so, well, I decided to start playing one just to find out what they were like, because if I might be trying to design one, it would be useful to know what there is.
Do you have a preference? I mean, is there one you prefer to use?
I mostly play EverQuest. My wife plays, or got into City of Heroes originally and is now playing mostly World of Warcraft. I drag her over to EverQuest once a week for a joint session with the character she has there.
Do you have much case where you're playing EverQuest and someone figures out they're playing against the guy who invented the genre?
No, hasn't come up.
Hasn't come up.
It'll be interesting when we finish up here. As I say, I have my guild has a raid at 6 o'clock, and I intend to just sort of mention at some point that what I spent my afternoon doing and see whether it leads to any conversation. But yeah, for the most part, the people there. Some of them know about the text adventure progenitors to the genre, but I don't know. I don't know how much they know where the online games started. Yeah, every once in a while I look and marvel at where the industry has managed to come in 30 years less. And a lot of that is, of course, again, the computer industry in general has been coming out with, amazingly more powerful machines over those same 30 years. The sort of things you can do now compared to then. But then, I've experienced that, my whole life with computers. Even the sort of 10 years or so from when I started working with the things till I wrote Adventure. The power and sophistication of what you could do on a computer was very different, even across that one decade. But it's been ramping up even more impressively since then. There are no conventions yet for the genre, and so the setting isn't as consistent. Sometimes I'm breaking the fourth wall. You give a command, and usually it's that you want to do this, but every once in a while the program reacts as though it just did it because you told it to, as opposed to you doing it because you said you wanted to. I think if you eat the food, it says, "Thank you, that was tasty," as opposed to saying, you eat the food and it was tasty. And yeah, there are some little inconsistencies like that, and whether it's because I was trying to break some rules to be, to catch the player off guard and keep it fresh, or just being sloppy, well, I don't know. Other people who made more sophisticated games had trouble with, but some of the puzzles, at least one of the puzzles in Adventure, is in some ways based on the fact that it's got a stupid language parser that only understands 2-word commands. And that's the one where you're trying to figure out how to put the vase down. Because if the command everybody has learned up to that point for putting an object down is drop. And you only have a 2-word command, so you say put down. Well, it doesn't know the word put. Down is a direction. It says you can't go down from here. And you say, you could try to say drop vase gently, and no, that's a 3-word command. It doesn't take 3-word commands. And I've seen people who are at that stage. They have the vase. It's been described over and over within the game as fragile, delicate, also, and they're going, I need to put this down to score points for it, and drop the vase, and sure enough, it breaks. And you have to figure out how to avoid that, of course, but the fact that there is no way to put it down gently is just purely an artifact of the game using two-word commands, and therefore having a limited vocabulary. And so I got to take advantage of that fact that the game language parser really is stupid, and build a puzzle on top of that. The place where where I draw the line is where you really need cultural knowledge that most people wouldn't have. If you're going to do that, you need some indication of where to look, what you're looking for. We were sitting at one table which had other award recipients at it, so that's a sort of specialized subset of the people who were present. But and I tried not to speak too long in my acceptance speech because I didn't want to bore people. And I really wish they would get the video of that up on the web. So they're still showing the ones from 2005, and I'd like my mom to be able to see it. But anyway, there were people who, well, of course, there was applause, which felt more than polite. So I think they liked that. And there were people who spoke to me afterwards, both in the presentation area and then later on the street afterward. At that point they would now recognize me, and so there were some people who came up to me just to thank me or make some comments and so on. So that was very nice. I think I touched briefly on the language processing part, where people have occasionally tried to point to adventure as an example of natural language understanding. And I go, there were better programs for that really were pretty stupid too at the time, like the ELIZA program and some similar ones that would actually have an interactive conversation, or would seem to, even though they didn't really understand anything you were saying. An adventure, the marvel is that you can do so much where really everything is a two-word command at best, and many of them it's really ignoring one of those two words. But the fact that you can say this and it will ignore that word, and the other word is enough for it to do what you wanted it to do, and it all comes out looking like it understood something really deep, but no, it really just worked out that way. You mentioned, as you were setting up, as an example of tales that may or may not be apocryphal, and it's hard to tell after they've been told enough times, was me contacting Crowther by sending mail to every site on the net. Now, I don't know whether it's that you've done the research and it's true, but I thought I'd mention that, yes, it's true. There were only, I forget whether it was a few hundred or maybe on the order of 1,000, somewhere in that ballpark number of sites on the ARPANET at the time. And so it wasn't that hard to send mail to all of them, but basically the original game that I had found just credited Will Crowther, and so I took the shot of sending to Crowther at each of these sites, and I got back lots of messages from mailers saying no such person, lots of other messages from administrators who monitor the mail coming in telling me no such person, and eventually I got a response from Crowther at Xerox, because that's where he was at the time. And I went, oh, okay. And that's how we got in touch. At some point it's not really adventure, it's the genre, and they've done their own game. And sure, there are plenty of those. I mean, there's Zork, there's Haunted House, and there are many of the others that came later. And those are fine, and people did their own games, and they have their own style to them. I mean, the Haunted House game was particularly weird because its style was trivia. As I recall, you had to recognize that some of the clues were referring to Brenda Starr to solve some of the puzzles. But that's okay. On the other hand, that wouldn't fit as an extension to adventure. And I've occasionally been disappointed when I've seen a version of adventure which has my game plus some extra stuff added on, and the extra stuff really doesn't seem to fit the feel of the game. Where it's far more complex interaction. You have to push these 5 buttons in the right order, and if you figure out the order because the colors on the buttons, the first letters spell magic or something. I think I saw that in one of the versions. And that's not the sort of thing that really defines the original adventure game. It's something that might not be so out of place in Zork, where that level of complexity was far more common. Bob Harris, who I mentioned earlier, is someone who helped on Adventure, played a little bit of Zork, and his comment was that you don't go into Zork to play, you go into Zork to do battle. And yeah, it was a lot more complex. You had to really be more on your toes to play that game. On the other hand, as I say, I like the Software Toolworks version, the extensions they had. There's something they added in the middle of the Troll Bridge that, and it used one of the other treasures to get to a place where you could get another treasure, and they had an extension off of the Plover Room was the other place they did an extension, and they fit in. The one off the Troll Bridge, not as much so, if only because they eventually when you get to the place, you climb down and find the new place, it didn't seem to fit the setting as much. It was sort of like the troll's office, and there was a rare stamp there, and okay, it's a little weird. It felt a little bit off to me, but it was close enough. We were willing to give that one a pass. Basically, in Adventure Version 2. One of the things I added was, like I said, some stuff outside the cave. So the forest that in Adventure Version 1 was really, I think, mostly 2 locations. You go in off the road and you find yourself wandering in the forest, and if you try to move from there, I think there's a second location you might reach, but mostly you're just moving at random with some small fractional chance that you get back on the road, and most of the time you stay lost. And instead, for Version 2, I made the forest a real maze. Distinct from the other 2, the twisty little passages, all alike and all different. I wanted all 3 mazes to have their own flavor. So the one in the forest in Version 2 has the feature that every location looks the same in that you can always go north, east, south, and west. Whereas the other mazes, well, one of them, of course, you can always go every direction. All the locations are interconnected. For the maze, all different. And the maze of passages, all alike. You can... somebody, in fact, figured out a way to map that maze based on identifying rooms by, okay, you go north, and if it works, you go back. You go east, if it works, you go back. And so on. And for each room, you figure out what directions can you move. And that just gives you enough of a way to distinguish the rooms that you can eventually map the maze without even dropping objects on the ground or anything else. The forest... everything you can go north, east, south, and west, and there are lots of ways that they loop around and back to each other and so on. And it was a fairly large maze, like 20 or so locations. And there were a couple of places in the forest that had new puzzles to solve. And one of them was you came to a clearing, and there's a rocky shelf that has an urn firmly embedded in the rock. And you try to take the urn, it's too firmly embedded in the rock. And eventually, the first steps are you have to use the bottle that you've got and bring some oil out into the forest and find the clearing and put the oil into the urn. Pour oil, and if you're there, it assumes you mean to pour it into the urn, using the old 2-word parsing. And then you light the urn, because the light was a command that already existed for lighting the lamp, so, okay, now you can light the urn. And I feel you have to rub it for good measure, but easily, having gone through these steps, you end up having a genie come out of the urn, and the genie easily wrests the urn from the rock, leaving a small cavity. And then he gives you, a fairly wordy clue with a hint hidden in a pun. And finally, actually, I could even probably remember the essentials of it. Is those who would traffic in precious gems must first learn the signs thereof. and he wrests the urn from the rock and turns back to you and extends a finger. Caution. And then he condenses, or he disappears into a cloud of amber smoke, and the smoke condenses and forms a small amber gemstone resting in the cavity in the rock where the urn had been. And you go, oh, okay. And you can take the amber gemstone. It's a treasure. Okay. That part's fine. And, well, if you experiment, you'll find that, well, you could take this other gemstone that you've got, which is the emerald the size of a plover's egg, and if you drop it while you're at that location, it'll fall into the cavity, and you have the emerald resting in the cavity in the rock. If you do that while you have the Persian rug with you, then when you drop it into the cavity, the Persian rug stirs on your shoulder for a moment. Okay, you figure out, aha, first you put down the rug, then you drop the green gemstone into the cavity, and the rug lifts off the ground and hovers there, and now you can get on it, and one of the words that has always been in the game but didn't do anything anywhere else was fly. Well, now you can use it, and it takes you somewhere where you find another treasure. And, okay, and you fly back, and you've got this new treasure with you, and okay, and you come back, and you take the emerald again, and okay, you've got the emerald now, and you take the rug, and no, it's stuck there. You can't take the rug back. It's still hovering. And you try putting the amber gemstone back in. It doesn't do anything. And at that point, I remember again a friend who I watched solve this one. He went, right, find Ruby. And responded that I can only tell you about things that are around you. I don't know where remote objects are. And he said, yes, but you know the word, don't you? There is a ruby in the game, and you need it to turn off the rug. And getting the ruby is a hard puzzle in itself. But again, this is a case of building on the existing puzzles. I already had the carpet. I already had the green gemstone. I used the amber gemstone with this clue about, traffic and signs and caution. Amber, there was the clue to get things started. And you get to this point, you go, oh dear, I need to solve this other puzzle to get the red gemstone before I can be done. But it sort of builds on itself, and it's clear what you're doing. So yeah, I like that one. I thought it played out well.
Right. But it's a level of complication much greater than...
Right. It's sort of the most complex puzzle in Adventure version 2. And certainly more complex than anything that was in version 1, because it is building on these other pieces. I mean, the haunted house one, as I mentioned, that part of it was a lot of it was based on trivia of all sorts, and that part was understandable. I mean, and it was clear going in. I mean, just getting into the place, I think you had to answer a random trivia question out of a set of half a dozen or so, like how many bristles on a typical cork dartboard. And yeah, you figure out the answer once, and there's a set of about half a dozen questions, and you could get past the gate to get into the house. But throughout the game, there would be things where there was a black orchid that showed up, and maybe there was something else that was another similar reference. But you really have to be a big trivia fan of the right kind of trivia to recognize that the black orchid is a reference to the Brenda Starr comic strip, where her lover was somebody who needed a black orchid as an ingredient of something that he needed to live. I don't remember. I never was a fan of Brenda Starr. I found out about this stuff because of the Haunted House game. And it turned out that way back at the beginning of the game, when it asks you your name, just so it has a name to refer to you by, you think, it turns out if you give the name of Brenda Starr's lover, that this is an essential thing to do, because at some point to get full score in the game, you're going to have to eat that black orchid to cure some disease you've picked up, and if you haven't given that name, it kills you because it's poisonous to anyone else. So there's no way to win the game unless you know that at the very beginning you have to claim to be so-and-so, who's the guy from the Brenda Starr comic strip. I mean, there was a time when, it was probably about 10 years ago now, where a lot of people would tell me that they got started using computers because of adventure. It was sort of the first thing they did on a computer, and then they made a career out of computers in one way or another. This most recent round of job hunting, which was about 2.5 years ago now, was sort of my first time running into people during the interview process who didn't, some of them, a lot of them still knew what adventure was and, could connect, oh, you're the one who did that. Impressive. But there were some, I began running into people who, adventure? Never heard of it. And that was new for me. We're starting to get into that stage where there are now people who, are in the computer industry and haven't heard of adventure, let alone had it been the seminal point of their career. Well, sure, the game's been around a long time, but the point is the game is, as you've noted, still around. I mean, it comes on many computer systems, and so for some people it's still one of the first things they may run into. But again, because there are more sophisticated games out now, people want the more immersive ones that have graphics or that have more complex storylines or building up. The games like Civilization and so on, where you can play this game over and over and it'll be different every time, and yet each individual game itself is can be an epic quest of its own. And those seem to draw people more. But there are still those who go for the, here's, again, the fact that it's text only limits its appeal as well now. I mean, I tried introducing my daughter to it, and, she enjoyed it somewhat, but it's just, there's not enough to it for her. People's tastes are different now that computers can do so much more. So it's harder. And, you run into the later games where you can have multi-word commands and ands and ors and thens and buts and... you can tell it to do all sorts of things, and it'll even actually mostly do it, but it does take away one of the features where part of the game is figuring out how to tell the computer what you want. And again, as computers have become more sophisticated, people have less patience for that, which is why people like his, Mark's daughter and mine, go, why can't I just do that? I want to mouse on something and make it do what I want. No, you have to figure out how to tell it. What? It's not a sort of game they're used to. There wasn't as much attention to detail, and in particular to avoiding detail. So there are room descriptions where something is mentioned just because it adds a distinctive flavor to the room, but the player's response is, oh, you mentioned rocks here. Let me try and pick up a rock. Well, no, you can't. And so you have to be careful if you go to include detail. You need the detail to make it seem real enough to be an interesting game. But you also have to be careful that the detail you include either doesn't seem like something that someone would try to interact with, or you really ought to be prepared to do the interaction, even if the interaction is, no, that's not going to help. Go, try something else. But there are places in adventure where you try to do something and either it doesn't know the word, even though it just used the word in the description of the room, so that seems a little hokey, or worse yet, it knows the word but it means something else completely. Rock, I think, was one which I had to take out from Crowther's version because there was a place that had rocks, and that was prominent enough in the description that if you said rocks, it would try to go to that place if you were nearby. But there were enough other places that had rocks that people would try referring to the rocks somewhere else, and they thought they were referring to it as a noun, but because of the way it's a stupid language parser in the game, it says rocks is a motion verb, and it doesn't apply here, and so you say rocks, and it says, I don't know how to apply that word here, or I can't get there from here, and you're going, what? I said, take rocks. You can't get there from here. And there are the rocks. They're right in the description. What do you mean I can't get there? And they just get all confused. So you have to be really careful not to mislead the player that way. Yeah, there was a fun one in the Haunted House game. Well, that was a similar sort of bug. I remember one of the puzzles there, you're in the upstairs room, and there's a bed with a mattress, and one of the puzzles involved taking the mattress off the bed and throwing it off the balcony so you could then jump off and not get hurt when you fell down. And meanwhile, there was another totally different puzzle down in an underwater section somewhere in the basement where the solution involved taking a rope that you had somewhere, and if you tied the rope to whatever it was that you were trying to retrieve, then later you could pull on the rope and bring the object to you, which was the only way to get the object out through the bathysphere or the airlock or whatever to get it to where you needed it. And I remember shocking the heck out of the author because I used those two different puzzles, and I took the mattress, tied the rope to it, wandered around the house for a while, eventually found myself in the dungeon, and pulled on the rope, brought the mattress from the outside on the yard where I'd used it in the first place, into the dungeon cell, and sent him the snapshot of text from, here I am in the dungeon cell with a mattress, and the commentary saying, I'm glad to see they've upgraded the accommodations in the dungeon. And he said, how the heck did you get the mattress into the dungeon cell? Because it hadn't occurred to him that these two puzzles had interacting pieces that way. And yeah, when you start running into that, you can get into these situations where the result in the game is not what what the designer wanted to have happen, because either it just makes something too easy and you may have an alternate solution that's easier than the one you intended, or what's perhaps worse is you can have people who try something that really ought to be a solution and nothing useful happens, and there's no explanation. You go, why didn't this work? And the answer is, well, the game designer didn't expect you to have this component here, and it's just, this whole setup isn't designed to use this thing. And no, the computer isn't really understanding the situation. It just knows, here's the list of items that can be done that have these effects, and that's not on the list. So, again, you have to be really careful as the games get big to make sure that the interactions don't come back and bite you, which is something you don't have to worry about as much in a live role-playing game, face-to-face role-playing game, although, frankly, similar things still happen where the players come up with a solution and the GM's going, that's not how I expected them to solve it. That's going to be far too easy. Do I throw a new obstacle in? Do I let them get away with it and drive on, and something else will happen later? But at least you can react better, and in particular, you don't run into the case of, no, that doesn't work for no obvious reason. Right. You can either give a reason, come up with a reason, or you can just let it work. Even though you didn't expect that particular solution, you can let it work. Computer games, you just don't have that flexibility. It's what got built in is what's going to work, and if the designer didn't think of it, then the player might get frustrated. Right. There was a sword in the stone with it was a rusty sword, but with a jewel-encrusted hilt, and you could pull the sword out of the stone, and now you have a rusty sword with a jewel-encrusted hilt. But doing so causes the door to shut, so you can't get out. Well, you can put the sword back in the stone, and the door opens. And what to do? How can you get out with the sword? And that's that's the sort of puzzle that would show up in classic adventure, and like how do you get across the troll bridge without losing a treasure and things like that. And they had a very nice solution to it in this case, which was you don't. You don't take the sword, you take the hilt. And when you do, it snaps off the sword, leaving the sword in the blade in the stone, and the door is still open. You walk out with the hilt, no problem. That's the part that had the jewels. The sword blade was all rusty. Cute. Yeah. No problem. If I were working on adventure, I would include that in my next revision, because I like that puzzle. I thought it fit in just perfectly. But like you say, other extensions I've seen, they're just, doing all sorts of weird things that A, don't fit the theme, but B, they don't fit the style. And, I thought that for the most part, the various puzzles in Adventure were of a style. Just like the puzzles in Zork are of a style. A more complex style, but they all sort of feel like they're at the same general level of complexity. Speaking of which, one of my other gripes against Zork, which I remembered while you were off there, is in at least one place I thought they were just unfair. There was a puzzle that had two solutions completely different, and one of them was easier to find, and it turned out you needed to do the other one. Again, for the spoiler section, the puzzle involved, I believe there's a Cyclops. It's been a long time now, but I think it was the Cyclops.
Cyclops.
Yep. And there was some way of getting past him. I forget whether it was that there was a way to lull him to sleep or sneak past him or something. There was a way to defeat him to get to some treasure he was guarding and take the treasure. And I did that. No problem. Mm-hmm. Later, I forget how I figured it out. Whether somebody just had to tell me or I saw the result of someone having done it and figured out what they must have done. I eventually found that there's another way to defeat the Cyclops, which was to say the name of whatever mythological hero it was who defeated the Cyclops. So there's Ulysses, Odysseus, somebody in that general category, I forget. You say his name to the Cyclops, and he is so frightened by the name of his ancient nemesis that he runs away. And in doing so, he runs through a wall somewhere, leaving a hole that you need later to get to something else. And later you see there's this Cyclops-shaped hole in some doorway. And having already solved the puzzle of how to get past the Cyclops, I didn't find there was any clue anywhere that there was anything else I was supposed to do with the Cyclops, let alone this particular thing to do with him. It was not something that was going to occur to me, not being particularly well-read on the ancient literature. And I just felt that one was unfair. And that's a case where you really do need to have the clues. And again, if there's going to be multiple solutions, there'd better be something that indicates you're not done. There's a limited audience for some of this stuff. I mean, it's sort of like art films. There are people who live for those films, but they're not going to be commercial success. You won't show them in the main theaters to the masses because the masses don't want to see that sort of thing. They don't want to think that way. They don't. They're there to be entertained. They're not there to go marvel at, oh yeah, well, that's a different way of looking at it, and so on and so forth. And yeah, you have that in lots of different genres. You have books and movies and games and all sorts of things where, different people have different tastes, and you can have things that cater to the limited group and just enjoy the adulation of your peers and get your satisfaction that way, even if you don't get rich on it. If the text itself isn't interesting to read, then it better have one heck of a gameplay to get people to come back to it. So you really need to have the text to keep you reading it, just like a good book, as well as giving you stuff to think about and problems to solve. And that's a tough balance, because again, you're writing for a diverse audience, unless you're doing something that's deliberately off the wall for some limited audience. Mostly you're trying to have something where everybody can appreciate it at some level, and some people might not get this reference, but you don't need to solve the puzzle, but it's there so that you can appreciate it as part of the wordsmithing. There are some, there are some places where I stretched it maybe a bit far. And again, version 2, the flying carpet puzzle I mentioned, the text that comes out at as you sort of get started or about the halfway point through that puzzle includes what might be for some a subtle pun, and for others it would be a blatant one. And if you miss it, well, okay, you might still figure out the puzzle, but it'll be a lot harder because that pun was your biggest clue.